Okay, so now here's the new scoring rubric. It's very pretty. It looks nice. There's color. Graphic design is their passion, as you can see. It's very cute. But if you will see, there are now three categories on this page, three scoring categories on this page. And if you go down, only two scoring categories on that page. So that means there's a total of five scoring categories. And what that means is if you go through the whole rigmarole that I went through with the previous scoring rubric, that the available points for you to get per judge have actually dropped from 30 to 25. Because my hunch is going forward, judges are still not going to go below 5 points as a baseline. So the upshot is the available points for each unit is basically has shrunk from 90 per judging panel to 75. It's not that big of a deal. And I think at this level, certainly at the regional level, but potentially at the state level, it's probably not going to matter that much because the schools that are competing are roughly equal to each other. And I think that it's unlikely that the decrease in available points is going to matter that much. But at other levels, it might. At the margins, it might mean that the scores are closer together. So the upshot is that each available point is more important than it was in the previous years. And if folks are not understanding that and want to put questions in the chat, feel free. But the upshot is with fewer scoring categories, each point is more important. The other really important thing about the scoring rubric that's different from the scoring rubric before is you see that first category that says opening statement. That means your testimony. That's the testimony that we're going to be working on today and that you will be working on over the next few months. Your prepared statement, that 4-minute testimony. That's its own scoring category. It used to be previously that there were some schools, and I'm sure that there will still be schools going forward, that had absolute dynamite testimonies, wonderful testimonies, but their follow-up Q&A, hot seat, whatever you want to call it, is not very good. I remember specifically, I was judging at the national level. I was listening to a Midwestern state do their testimony, and I thought this is one of the best testimonies I've ever heard. It's just home run after home run after home run, and then and I was like really excited for the Q&A. I asked my first question that I thought was a softball, and it was a swing and a miss. And then the entire time they just fell flat on their face. And the problem with those types of testimonies is those types of judging those types of units was that there was a category for understanding. Well, their testimony demonstrated understanding, but their Q&A didn't. Or their testimony used a lot of evidence, but their Q&A didn't. And so it was very difficult to put a one number score on that unit. And now, for judges, to make it easier, we've eliminated that. So now, when I'm listening to the testimony, at the end of that testimony, I know what I'm going to put in that first scoring rubric or that first scoring category for the opening statement. You can say that was an 8 for a testimony, or that was a 10, and I can just write it in. And then I can focus on the Q&A going forward, the remaining 4 categories going forward. Now, what that means is that the testimony is 20% of your score automatically, and it will be 20% of your score. 20% of your score is a huge percentage of your score. That doesn't mean that the testimony is not important. In fact, it means, if anything, it means the opposite. 20% is going to be the difference between schools that succeed at a very high level and schools that do not. So I really don't want you to look at this updated scoring rubric and think, oh, well, it's only one category. I don't have to worry about it. That's absolutely not true. Okay. So the last thing that I want to kind of focus on the new rubric is if, Sabrina, if you can go to page 2, that last category, the discussion category right there, that discussion category essentially melds two of the previous categories. One was participation, which used to be very kind of like a numbers game. If you spoke up, you said something, you got points. If everybody on the Q&A or everybody in the unit in the Q&A spoke up, I would usually put a 10 in the participation category, because it was really just, did they participate? But now it's added a factor in there. And the factor is, you've got to have reasoned positions using evidence, constitutional principles, and legal precedents to support their claims. It essentially melds participation with reasoning. So not only do you have to say stuff in the Q&A, you've got to say stuff that matters and that makes sense and that is responsive to the question. And that puts an additional burden on folks. It's not a huge burden. It's a burden that you guys will be able to meet. I have no doubt. You have some of the best coaches in the country on Q&A, and California schools doing Q&A always knock it out of the park. I think in general, this new scoring rubric favors schools like California because it does specifically emphasize Q&A, and Q&A is usually something that we excel at. And so I think that this will be good for us, but it does mean that you can't just speak up and say something. You've got to speak up and say something that matters, that uses evidence, that uses reasoning and constitutional precedents, in order to move the ball, in order to get full points on discussion. And so I think it's going to be interesting going forward. It's certainly a lot easier for judges to judge with this rubric than it was to judge it with the old rubric. That's my hunch. Just looking at it, it looks a lot easier to me. I guess it's possible that there are some things that are going to come up that I am not anticipating at this point. In general, I think it will help schools like California, schools in California that really emphasize Q&A and emphasize reasoning and being responsive in Q&A. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say on the rubric. If anybody has any questions, or if any volunteers want to add on, feel free.
I just wanted to say also, like, as a reminder, in addition to it now being 20% of your score, the testimony is super important for setting up what actually gets discussed in the question and answer period. And so you should really be focusing on it, and we will talk about it in more detail about what kinds of things you want to put in the testimony to set up a good Q&A. But just remember that, you know, it's going to affect all parts of the scoring rubric at the end of the day. Anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat about this.
I have a quick question about the participation component, or like the last component you were mentioning in the new rubric. So does that kind of emphasize, because you were kind of talking about how now reasoning is a bigger factor in kind of like scoring participation. So are judges more looking forward to a larger quantity of evidence, or does the quantity not really matter as compared to like the general quality of a solid like line of reasoning?
That's a great question, and it's a question that I think is going to be answered over time. I mean, I think that it's not possible for me to answer it with just a simple statement. It really depends. Some units and some questions on units, you really want a lot of evidence. You really want, if I'm asking for, if I ask a question as a judge where I'm asking for, what kind of evidence can you use to support a position that you've taken in your Q&A, then I'm looking for perhaps a lot of evidence. But a lot of times what you're going to want to do is it's not necessarily just picking the most evidence or like machine gunning cases at judges. It's about picking the best evidence to answer that particular question. And sometimes, and this is another thing about the rubric that I think I think is important. Sabrina, can you pull it back up again? Hang on. Sorry, it's evidence. Okay. Analysis, understanding. Oh, okay. No, in the analysis understanding category, that first bullet point for under meets expectations, it talks about key judicial decisions, amendments, historical context, societal movements. And that phrase is a little bit different than the previous rubric, where that highlights, did you hit the most important evidence, not necessarily just evidence in general that might move the ball. And one thing that I think that California schools sometimes don't do the best at is identifying the key evidence, because because we practice so much and we've been doing this for so long, we get a little hipster with our evidence sometimes. We're like, oh no, yeah, sure. I mean, I could cite Brown v. Board, but what I am actually going to do is cite this Ninth Circuit opinion from 1975 that I think is cooler. And really, what you should hit is Brown v. Board because it's the more important evidence. Does that make sense? So I think it's a great question, Runab, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. It's not a question that can be answered easily. It really depends on the context, but that's something that's going to come with experience as you go on and as your units go on and practice these sorts of questions.
Thank you.
Can I add something onto that real quick?
Yeah.
Can you scroll down real quick? I think a big difference that I've noticed, the biggest difference for me, is that it doesn't say participation anymore. It says discussion. And I think going back to Runab's question real quick, I think this was feedback that my unit got specifically a lot. And it was our ability to foster discussion with the judges. How do you make Q&A interesting for your judges so they want to ask more questions? And a large part of that is making sure that all of your evidence is relevant. And I know Clint like differentiated between the types of questions, but I think this is also going to be, how are you making your Q&A interesting almost? And I think that's a new aspect that it's bringing in, which is really interesting.
Great point.
All right, any more questions? All right, thanks everyone. That was a really helpful discussion. Next, we're going to have Suba lead us off with going over the materials that hopefully you all have already looked at, because we sent it about a week ago to your teachers to send on. So Suba is going to start us off. Suba, do you want me to screen share for you?
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Sabrina. So, hi everyone. Today we're going to quickly run through how competition judge, like working with the judges is going to go during the competition. This is more about like presentation, but I think all of the things that Clint and Jayani just talked about around making sure that your judges feel included in the process is really critical to making sure that the Q&A feels like a discussion and not like a hot seat. We used to call it hot seat, but I think the real idea is actually making it a discussion between you and the judges and getting them involved and interested. So just to start things off, before you read out your testimony, you want to be cool, not creepy with the judges. Say hi, be pleasant, like just be yourselves, but don't necessarily try and do things as a unit like sing or all say hi at the same time. It's just a little bit too much. Just state your name, state your school, state your unit. Usually the first person in your unit will say we are from X high school, representing the state of California. We are unit 5 and this is our teacher or whatever. And then you all go down the line and state your name for the judges. You'll also have name tags, so make sure that you keep them in front. So if you say, Jayani and I agree and Clint disagrees, it's important to kind of know who those people are, because again, we don't have your testimony in front of you. We only see you as people. So we want to know who you are. Don't spend a lot of time on this. This is really quick before we start, maybe no more than like 30 seconds to a minute. speak clearly, speak slowly. We're going to keep saying this to you throughout practice. I know that you have a lot of information, but as a judge, I am consuming it just by hearing it. So if you go too quick, you're going to gloss over the points that are really important. And to Clint's point, we want to make sure that you are citing the key points so that you're getting those, those fundamental baseline. Like, yes, I understand that this person has covered the key cases that are relevant for this particular audience. Make sure that you look at us when you're, delivering your testimony as much as possible. We know that you're reading from a sheet. You don't have to have it memorized, but when you look at us, it puts us at ease. It should put you at ease. It's like having a real conversation. And so really focus on, building connection, but also, make sure that you're enunciating clearly, pronounce the words in your testimony, practice your testimony, don't trip over words when it comes to competition, because we're not going to ding you for that, but it kind of slows out the process, and you have a fixed amount of testimony, a fixed amount of time for testimony and fixed amount of time for QA. So don't waste it if you mess up your pronunciation. Okay. This is really critical to what Clint was talking about. This next bullet is really focused on judges are going to talk to you after after you finish your Q&A. You need to still be checked in and locked in when we give you feedback. The reason is because you're going to use that to improve yourselves for the next competition that you're going to be in. The other critical thing is that when judges are trying to give you feedback, what you want to do is understand what didn't work for them, because that is what you need to work on for the next cycle. You need to be super clear about what you want from your testimony, and that still needs to be consistent in your Q&A. And so if the judge is saying that you're not consistent between your testimony and your Q&A, you have a big problem. Additionally, the discussion, I think one of the reasons that you're moving away from participation and moving into this kind of discussion category is because as a judge, you're gonna want to be able to ask multiple questions during that 8-minute Q&A, because if you only get out one question and everybody else got out two, it may just mean that like you run out of time or some answers were long. So just make sure that there's, as much as there's equal participation between your unit, make sure that your judges also get equal participation in terms of questions, if that's an option, if there are judges who want to ask more questions. Great. We are super supportive through CACE. We will help you with your testimonies, async. We are hosting these workshops. But during the competition, there will be kind of some separation between us. We're not going to hang out and chat with y'all in the same way, because we kind of have to be objective. But also, we don't necessarily want any perception of like some ideas carrying over from one school to another school, or if there's inconsistent grading. So we'll try and just give you some space during that time. But yeah, take into account all of the practices. We're definitely there for you as a resource. And finally, we kind of talked about it, but scoring is not going to be the same from last year to this year. People on panels have different perceptions about how students perform. It's on the judges to kind of talk through those concerns. But at the end of the day, if Sabrina, Clint, and I are on a panel, it's very unlikely that we're all going to have the same score, just based on the way that we perceive the testimony. So I just want you all to know that, like, even if there are discrepancies within the panel, we talk to each other before we submit our scores. And then, you're just going to have to, like, law of large numbers, assume that everything's going to work out. Any questions on like how competitions will go, or how you should come into the practices and competitions?
One thing I just wanted to add, and that Clint kind of hinted at, especially because we have a new rubric this year, the judges are going to take some time to like calibrate to how they're going to be informed in doing their judges. So it's going to be a little bit interesting to see how things work out with this new rubric, but we're going to be using it for all the competitions this year. So just keep that in mind. I think we'll probably be very wedded to the new rubric this year, and it'll be less likely, in my estimation, that judges will try and lean on what they've done before. So it will be a little bit interesting, and just really important that to the extent you're aware of the scores that were of your schools from last year, like don't put any merit into comparing yourselves between years, because it's really a whole new ball game.
And also, just for context, like, I don't want you guys to fixate on the rubric necessarily, just because when we practice, we're not necessarily giving you scores or numeric values. It's just not going to translate for competition if we were to do that on a practice level. But I think it's good for you all to be aware that this is how we typically judge. But all of the rubric, kind of like tenets of the rubric, are what we're going to use to kind of inform how we structure our feedback to you over the next couple months.
Any questions?
Yeah, I was wondering about Q&A and these workshops. Can we practice Q&A with the CACE volunteers and judges, or is it just testimony writing?
It's going to be both. It's definitely going to be both. When you're first starting, since you all just got your units, a lot of work is probably, the bulk of your work right now is probably going to be focused on the testimony and getting that to a good place. But at some point, you're going to kind of reach a place where your testimony is in good shape. And that at that point, I think the value really comes in just like refining the Q&A. But throughout all of the CACE practices, we're always going to be doing like QA and testimony. Like the testimony writing workshop today is kind of your first chance at just like focusing on like, what is a good testimony? You're going to take that, you're going to implement that in your own units. But when it comes to practice, it's going to be the full real deal, like testimony and Q&A, and you're going to get feedback for both.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so the structure of the practices, which is not what today is. Today is the testimony writing workshop. The practices are going to be, you're going to do all three of your questions fully from introductions to testimony to question and answer to us giving feedback for every single one of your questions. So we're going to hit everything, and you are free to ask us questions in the Discord about Q&A stuff like, oh, this question came up. How do you think we should answer it? Or, I found this piece of evidence. Do you think it's relevant to answering X question? And that's especially valuable when you're following up with us after a practice where you got some feedback from us and you want to get some more information to implement that feedback. So yes, we cover all the bases here at CACE. Okay, next we're going to work on briefly go over the congressional hearing testimony outline format. So I'm going to kick it off to Jayani.
Hi, everyone. So we kind of went over everything before, but I think this is a very underrated part of writing testimony. I don't think people spend enough time organizing their arguments, and it becomes clear when judges or when I'm hearing testimony. And I realize that like there is no organizational like thing for their testimony, and it makes it very difficult to follow. Anytime you get feedback of like judges being unable to answer, like give you questions, or like hard discussion, or like judges just like questioning, oh, did you cover this subtopic or anything? A lot of it is because of your outline structure, and because your outline wasn't organized enough, or your testimony wasn't organized enough. So to go through it real quick, most testimonies start with an introduction of some sort. Depending on the unit, a unit might choose to make it like really short, really elaborate. It's kind of like up to each unit. But then what you're going to notice is that there's, I think in this specific one, there's like 9 arguments or whatever. But essentially you're going to spend about 2 to 3 paragraphs on each part of your question. So has everyone seen their district questions yet? Right. So your district questions and all your questions going forward are essentially going to have your 3 parts: your main question or your umbrella question, your sub question, your first sub question, and your second sub question. Something that you're going to notice in the outline is that we are spending equal time on the main argument and the sub arguments, or your sub questions. And I think that's really important. And that's a big piece of feedback a lot of units get early on, is that you're not spending equal time on each part of the question. Each part of the question matters equally, right? So it's really important that it's like you give them the necessary amount of time. And then if we go through it in more detail, each argument has a topic sentence, a concrete detail, and commentary. If there's one thing that like units, I really, really, really like tell units to do afterwards, it's to stick with like a claim, evidence, reasoning standpoint, and that's exactly what this outline is doing. When you organize the arguments, when you organize your outline like really, really early in testimony writing itself becomes really easier, and it becomes much easier for judges to know what evidence you're using and what is your opinion on that evidence. Being able to link everything back is really, really important. So for each argument, you should have a piece of evidence, you should have reasoning, and you should have a claim. You should know what you're arguing for that. I had a thought, but it slipped my mind. And then the other, and then after you have an outline, not only does it make testimony writing easier, but it is much easier to go back and change your argument. One big thing that I hear a lot in feedback is that a lot of people, like a big piece of thing that I get from students and from judges is that it's hard to write a testimony that is oriented towards like an oral testimony specifically. And I think having a testimony outline really, really helps, because one of the biggest fallacies that like all early students fall for is making your testimony too essay-like. It's too fluffy. There's too much writing and not enough like breadth to it, like not enough like concrete stuff for judges to listen to. And that makes it really difficult from a judge's perspective, because you're waiting for the argumentative parts, you're waiting for that claim, evidence, reasoning. And I think dissecting it down or condensing it down to something as simple as an outline kind of breaks your like need to make it really essay-like, if that makes sense. It ensures that you have a argumentative purpose without actually being really, really fluffy, if that makes sense. That's kind of all I had to say. Is there anything anyone else wanted to add on to that?
Just say that not only is this tool good when you're first starting out, but also if you're getting feedback that your testimony is like too dense or hard to follow, you can do a reverse outline, which is taking what you have and breaking it down into its parts, so that you can see like maybe what the issue is. It'll help you figure out where to cut. Anyone else have anything to add or any questions from the students? Okay, seeing none. I'm gonna briefly talk about styles of testimony. So, I think that, and we kind of touched on this already, but every testimony has to have certain things to make it easier to follow. That includes roadmaps. Judges, this is where I'm going to go. This is what we are going to talk about. This is what we're going to cover, as well as signposts. I said I was going to cover this. Now here's this thing. Of course, that's not how you're going to say it in the actual testimony. But usually a roadmap will involve listing maybe 3 points you're going to make at the top, and then going to first says your first point, second says your second point. This is going to be really helpful to the judge, because even the best testimonies, sometimes it's easy for the judge to get a little bit lost, because when you hear things, you miss things. And so having those signposts can help reorient the judge to where you want them to be, and to make sure that they're following along. Also, having a clear conclusion to signal the end is really important, because that's when the judge will know when to jump in with questions. Also, to make sure that your testimony is ending in a timely fashion at the 4-minute mark or just before it. And it will help jumpstart you into the Q&A. And so a lot of times people will like conclusions, sort of step off and posing a question to the judges, not a literal question, but bringing up a topic or a point that you really want to talk about in Q&A. Conclusions is sometimes a very good place to do that. So here's sort of like a suggested hook roadmap format. You can either, this is like usually something that you set up in the introduction. You use a metaphor or a simile to make it easier for the judge to figure out where you're going. I know that my unit, Unit 5, we had a question about what were the different pillars of the Constitution, of the Bill of Rights. And so what we did is kind of did a foundation metaphor of what's the foundation, and sort of went through as a building. This is the first pillar, this is the second pillar, under it all is the foundation. So doing something like that. There's also some examples that are a little bit more on the fun side, like long distance relationships rarely work out, and talking about Britain and the colonies. Sometimes fun similes or metaphors work, and sometimes they don't. That's why it's such a fun process, and working with CACE to help you figure out what works and what doesn't. I think it's really important that you try things out to see what works, and don't be afraid to do a little bit something on the funky end, as long as it's clear and easy to follow, because that will also make your testimony memorable. And then question dissection. This is especially true when you have a question that involves like a complicated quote or a question that has many different subparts. It's really important that you outline in your testimony what parts you agree with and what you don't. And sometimes that's something that's hard to get down. You kind of have to figure out the best way to verbally express, I'm agreeing with A, B, C, and D, but our unit disagrees with E, or 3 of our unit mates agree with A and B, but disagree with C and D. So you want to make sure you're balancing being accurate and making clear how the question breaks down, and also where you all end up on it. And oftentimes in these questions, not so much in the district questions, but as you proceed through this process at state or the national questions, they oftentimes will kind of pull a quote from the middle of a document without giving any context, and that question assumes the quote means something as it goes on. And it's really important that you go read the source of that quote and make sure it's accurate. And if it's not, or you disagree with how the quote is being construed, that you lay that out in the testimony. So that's really important. And this is something I had flagged already, but team breakdown. So it's really important that you divide the issues and the questions based on how you actually feel, so that your testimony comes off genuine. Well, I guess taking a step back, first of all, it's typically good to have disagreement among your unit mates on questions that arise, because you're able to show all parts of the question are being answered and all sides are being shown. But this just is a reminder to try not to force it. So if you all are really in agreement on one thing and you can't find any nuance, don't force it. But when you do have disagreement, being able to highlight it in a clear and consistent way is really a good way to handle the testimony and to break out some really interesting discussions in the Q&A portion. And again, if you take a position in your testimony, you must be consistent with taking that in the Q&A. So if you get asked, you have to remember the position that you take. You are that person now, at least for this testimony, at least for this question. I've had a lot of situations where people are like, I believe this in testimony. And then when you go to the Q&A and you're like, so can you explain more about why you believe that? And they'll be like, oh, I don't believe that, or no, I disagree completely. So yeah, make sure you are consistent on that front. There's also a style of testimony that involves historical personification, where you pretend to be a key person in order to emphasize a viewpoint. I think this can come off as extremely cheesy, and so you want to be careful with making sure that you're not turning it into sort of like an acting class. But I think this is a good way to remember that if you are believing a certain historical figure, like you want to take on what James Madison believed, instead of acting out that person, you can kind of just say James Madison believed this, and sort of he would think X and Y, and that can maybe take out the cheese of this presentation. Also, people will often begin with a direct, short, or responsive anecdote. This is especially, I think, effective in Unit 6, though it can be effective depending on the question across the board, of providing an anecdote that really hones the judges into not only what this topic, this question is about, but also your take on it. I think that you want to make sure it's short and it's not like an overextended story, and also communicates the idea right off the bat, because you don't want to waste too much time covering somebody else's anecdote or somebody else's words when you need to be answering the questions directly. So you do have to be careful of that. Then lastly on this list, this is probably the most popular one, but certainly not something that you have to do, which is start with a quotation. I would only do this if it's directly on point, and that it is really like thought-provoking or important. Most of these questions themselves will often have quotes already. And so adding another quote on top in your introduction can be kind of confusing, or hard for the judge to follow. But sometimes quotes can set the tone and help lead you into a really effective presentation. So you have to kind of weigh what the questions are asking and how important the quote really is for what's going on. It's really important you give context to the quote, either by explaining who said it or the context of what was said, or show the consequence of a question by using a quote from after its impact. I think that's can be particularly effective and is better than just like sort of using a quote for the sake of using one. Okay. Are there any questions about the different styles of testimony that I just went over? And again, since I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat, can't see your faces, so please speak up if you have a question.
Going back to what, sorry, what I believe Jayani said about instead of, I don't know if it was like the last section, but having your testimony be more of like an oral testimony instead of a written one. Would it be best maybe to sometimes like, this is a weird idea, but to maybe like have an outline of a testimony and then just try like speaking it and then like a very basic outline and then write the testimony after practicing that?
I I think testimony, I think you're thinking more of a speech. A testimony is still incredibly structured and it's a very formal presentation of information, if that makes sense. So it's not really like a speech in the sense where you're kind of coming up with it in the spot and you want it to flow naturally, right? But this is a testimony. It's meant to be formal. It's meant to have structure and it's meant to be a little bit more rigid. But I think where people go really like on the other hand, where it becomes really fluffy and really essay-like is when they want it to sound like they're trying to make, they're just, I don't, Sabrina, do you have a better way to put it into words? I feel like I'm rambling, but I'm not getting to the point.
No, I think you're directly on point. I think, yeah, it's this idea that people will overwrite. They found all this like amazing, really dense evidence that they're really excited to use, and they try and force everything in it all at once in one paragraph, and they make it like the most beautiful but very complicated paragraph. And you're like, this is beautiful. I could submit this to a journal, like a political journal or something. And then you read it out loud and everyone's like, what are they saying? I don't know. I just wrote down like 3 words because I couldn't follow it. So I like, that's what you want to stay away from. But on the other hand, well, I like your suggestion, and it kind of depends on the process. Remember that you are writing this with other people. And I think the best way to divide work with a testimony is oftentimes to divide up sections. And so if you're like really having trouble articulating the point you're trying to make, then maybe like recording yourself trying to riff off of an outline could be helpful in getting past that point. But at the end of the day, you should definitely have like a written testimony that you will be reading from to actually present.
I think that's an important point, Sabrina, is to remember that you'll be reading this testimony. So you don't have to memorize it. There are schools who will memorize it, but you do not have to memorize your testimony. And so it's better to spend the time to do that language crafting in the written testimony, because how you speak naturally is probably going to be a little less formal and a little less structured than how you're going to read something that you've written.
I also want to add on also a big part of testimony writing is word choice, right? The words you use really, really matter because you're using so few of them when you're writing testimony, right? And so when you're trying to come up with something on the spot, your words just simply aren't as powerful as you want them to be.
Any other questions?
I had a question about the disagreement. It's actually two questions. One, how do you indicate disagreement in your testimony without having kind of like an abrupt, like, I disagree with this point? Because I think that's like the hardest struggle, which I understand there has to be disagreement and we do disagree, but like making it like seamless. And then two, are there points that you know that you have disagreement on, but you can like save it for Q&A where you can like, you don't bring out every piece of evidence. We obviously have disagreement on how it's applied, but then like what's the like middle ground of how much you save for Q&A and how much you actually put in your testimony?
Okay, so those are great questions. I think that it's an art form for sure. And one thing that I'm going to touch on later on in the workshop is that, first of all, what you're writing now is not going to be what you're presenting at the first competition or the second competition. You're going to rewrite these testimonies like 100 times. And then when you get to the state questions, it's going to be the same thing. And if you get to nationals, it's going to be the same thing. And so, first of all, keeping that in mind, you're going to have to just figure out what works. That, I think, is a really awkward thing to try and navigate, is saying, we disagree with this. I think that the typical way to do it is you kind of set out the issue and then you say, Suva and Jayani agree with this topic, but I and Clint disagree. And you kind of go from there, and you kind of just have to say it like that. But again, it's a lot of finessing and seeing what works. And one of the great things about the testimony writing workshop we're going to be doing later is the breakout rooms where we can work with you on kind of the way you're coming up with and work on suggestions for how to make it smoother. But I do think it's challenging. And then as to your second question, also really great. First of all, I want to clarify that you shouldn't be bringing up random disagreements like topical disagreements in your testimony. Like, the things you disagree on should be directly related to the questions that are in your testimony. Because if you're disagreeing on kind of like a topic that you have just come across that you know is like somewhat related to the testimony, it's going to be confusing for the judges to see how it relates back to the questions being posed. So those are definitely things that you can save for Q&A to discuss when it comes up from a judge's question. But aside from that, like, I think if you all disagree with like one of the main questions, any of the questions in the testimony, like, that is something that you should be putting in the testimony that you don't have to save for later, because you have to answer the question. So I think that's kind of the easy dividing line. Obviously, once we start working on the testimonies together and you have like a specific question, like, that's the exact kind of thing that CACE can help you work through, or you can send on the Discord channel so that we can answer in a little bit more detail. But that's kind of where I'm at. Does any other volunteers have some thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I guess more broadly, I maybe the spirit of the question is more around like, you don't want to undercut your teammate. Like, you don't want to do that in a mean way. You may have an ideological disagreement, and it's totally fine to say that Sabrina and I think this way and Jayani thinks another way. Similar to how, if you think about it, this happens at the Supreme Court level, right? Like, one of the justices will issue a majority opinion. Someone can give a concurrence, but someone can also issue a dissent, right? Like, you can be fundamentally, this is why this is wrong, or why I disagree with this. And you can do that in like a nice way. I think to the second point of your question of like, how much do I keep in testimony versus how much do I keep for the Q&A? What you'll learn over the next few, like, I would say, practice sessions and over the next 2 months is you're going to figure out what is important that you need to hit to kind of technically answer the question, but you're also going to know what you need to drop a carrot for. There's going to be something that you're going to say that's maybe a little controversial or a little bit like, oh, I'm not going to put in some detail and I'm really going to hope that they ask me that question because I'll have it ready in my back pocket. And you're going to learn to do that. That's not something that you're going to know like right out the gate. But once you like meet with us, we're going to be able to say like, drop this as a nugget. And then you hit, like, if I am a judge and I see this nugget, I might go for it. I might just say like, you know what, I think they want to start this like discussion with me. I'll take the bait. And then if you hit me and like the whole panel with like this beautiful response, because you already knew it was coming, because you set it up for me to ask that question, that's honestly the best outcome for you as a team, because it shows that one, you're prepared, one, you've thought about the discussion, you've engaged me as a judge to want to ask this question, and you come up totally prepared. So you're going to get there. It's not going to happen overnight, but over the next couple of months, you're going to figure out with your teachers, with us, with any of the folks that you're working with outside of this program, that there's just going to be stuff that comes up that's super interesting or temporarily relevant that's going to make sense to nugget and like leave carrots for in your testimony.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so we're gonna take a 10-minute break. So everyone come back at 11:15. Once we do that, we're gonna get ready for the breakout rooms. When you come back, please make sure that you have your unit name, your unit number, and your school in there, because we're gonna do breakout rooms based off of your unit and your school specifically. So that's the best way for me to help sort everyone. So see you all back at 11:15.